Hello, I'm Scarlett Karoleva, reporting live from the MCC Festz, sitting here today with the one and only Michael Shellenberger. Michael, so good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been seeing you a lot lately in Europe. I mean, you were in the European Parliament not too long ago. What do you think of Europe at the moment?
I'm really concerned about Europe. I mean, Europe is obviously the birthplace of Western civilization, of our civilization in the United States. What we're seeing emerging from within Europe is, I think, a real totalitarianism, and it's manifesting really dramatically right now in Britain, also in Germany and France, particularly in this desire to censor speech. But also, surprisingly, this lawfare. We saw the European Union basically tell one of the presidential candidates in Romania that he could not participate in the runoff. We now see an effort to either incarcerate or prevent one of the front runners of the French presidential election, Marine Le Pen, from running for office. There's been efforts to criminalize the AfD, the German Conservative Party. And this is all very shocking on the one hand. On the other hand, we saw this happening in the United States against Donald Trump and trying to prevent him from running. If I have any hope at all, it's just that there will be a backlash against it. I think it's important for people to understand that many people in the United States were not voting for Donald Trump as much as they were voting against the Democrats and against the censorship, the lawfare, the efforts to essentially criminalize their political opposition. But those forces we had hoped would back off after the election of Trump in November. But instead, I'm afraid they've actually been more aggressive. And so we've seen an acceleration of efforts through, both in Britain's Online Safety Act and also in Europe's Digital Services Act to expand this model of censorship where basically small committees of experts chosen by the governing parties are in a position to decide what we're allowed to read and hear online.
I think you pointed so many things out that are important to cover. Of course, the Digital Service Act, you don't have a democracy if there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of expression.
Yep.
It becomes 1984. Of course, as you said, we try to change the system in a democratic way, but then every time we get backlash, the AfD, they try to ban them, saying that they're an extremist party. Even members of the AfD are banned now to work for governmental positions, for example, as an officer. We see the same playbook happening in France.
Yep.
Netherlands, Geert Wilders wasn't even allowed to become prime minister, even though he became the biggest party during the elections. But it makes one wonder, we try to play it democratically. At the same time, we see that the European Commission, these unelected bureaucrats, they seize power. Ursula von der Leyen,
yep.
she even survived this motion of no confidence. Basically, we're saying to her, okay, go ahead with your corruption. There will be no repercussions.
Right.
I think a lot of people in Europe feel a deep sense of desperation. Mm-hmm. Okay, we go to the ballot. I do my democratic duty, yet I'm getting a totalitarian state. What can I do now?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's a huge question. I think, obviously when you're in a situation like this, you have to resist as though your life depends on it. So certainly taking to the streets is obviously necessary here. I think resisting in the European Parliament, running candidates for office. I think that, one of the things that can be learned from the United States is that appealing to the traditional national values of free speech, of democracy, reminding people of communism and totalitarianism. It's so incredible. I went back and reread George Orwell's 1984. It was so contemporary. And we see in Britain, we see in Brussels, these efforts to do exactly what George Orwell had feared would happen, that would come straight out of the bureaucracy. So I think that on the one hand, it's sort of the best of times and worst of times. On the one hand, you have this very totalitarian reaction from the governing parties to exclude conservative parties, mm-hmm. But I think you also see incredible levels of support for conservative parties. I mean, more support than ever for the AfD in Germany, more support, as you mentioned, Geert Wilders won in the Netherlands, his party won in the Netherlands, we see in France. And so ultimately, public opinion is the most essential thing to this. And I think the left and the governing left in Europe has just gone so far, become so extreme, that really the challenge for the right, I think, is to maintain a moderate position that can win over people on the center, because of course just appealing to right-wing votes isn't going to be enough. And having a governing coalition requires doing much more what the Trump administration did, or what Trump did when he ran for president this last time, which was to appeal to some pretty broadly held values. And, even things like, it was mass migration, inflation, the economy, but even an issue like transgenderism, gender ideology, 71% of Americans oppose gender medicine, basically drugs and surgeries for children. 79% oppose males and female sports. So I think there's certain cultural issues as well that can play to the advantage of the conservative movement.
Yeah, one thing that you pointed out is that people need to take ownership over that. I do recognize that there are certain countries where people are inclined to be more obedient and acceptant. We've seen it, of course, as well during the COVID draconian measurements when we were literally forced to stay in our home. We couldn't even go on the streets. And we obeyed, even though those measures had no scientific backing. One country that is different is the country where we're in. It's here in Hungary. Soros has been showing strong leadership, closing the borders, which has proven to be very effective. What do you think makes Hungary different? Why do they have this? Why are they not afraid to be isolated? Because they are becoming isolated. In European Commission, Orban is being ignored. They laugh at them, they mock them, but they stand strong for their nation.
I'm not a Hungary expert, but just having been here a few times, a couple of things. I think first, with all the Eastern European countries, there's still some memory of communism. There's still some memory of totalitarianism. Western Europe is a quite different situation. That was a big part of it. And I also just think the leadership of Orban, the clarity of his main advisor, who's also named Orban, but they're not related. He wrote a book called The Hungarian Way of Strategy, which is a really thoughtful approach to what a conservative democratic movement in Hungary would look like. But look, they're challenged here. I think that they made a terrible mistake in trying to stop the LGBT protest. I think that protest march would have been a lot smaller had the government not tried to ban it. So I think that the challenge for the right, and this goes for the United States as well, is that if you're going to win over people in the middle and even many people on the left, you have to be pro-free speech. You have to be adamantly pro-democratic. I think that if you get into a situation where you're trying to stop protests or persecute your political opposition in any way, I think then you have a potential of shrinking your coalition and then losing power, which very well may happen here in Hungary next year.
But don't you think it's also needed to make a statement saying, okay, we stand for sovereignty, this is our nation, we don't want to have a pride? It's still within their authority. Don't you think it's stronger for them to make that statement opposed to saying, okay, we're just going to obey? Because the European Commission, once you obey with them, they think you will do it another time as well.
Well, I think it's one thing to whether or not to embrace the LGBT agenda in government. And I agree with you. I'm a huge critic, particularly of the transgender movement. What they're doing to children and vulnerable adults is horrific. It's really one of the worst medical scandals in human history. But that's different than people marching on the streets. I think people have to be free to express themselves. In the United States, we have a very high bar for free speech. We allowed Nazis to march through neighborhoods of Jewish people, neighborhoods of Holocaust survivors. It's always shocking when people realize that. But we allow a huge amount of free speech. Europe, not in the same way, but I do think what I would have, if I were advising the Hungarian government, I would have allowed the LGBT protests to occur and just criticized it, and said that we oppose this transgender radicalism. But I think that they turned it into a freedom march by attempting to ban it. I think there was many more people that just went out in the street in solidarity because they were fearing Orban oppression and stifling of their views. And so I think that was a mistake. I'm not saying that's the main problem that they've had, but I certainly think it's one of them.
And another problem that you also address in that is not only the pride, but also the NGOs that are playing a growing role within society because they're used as a mouthpiece, as a propaganda by proxy by the government. It came out that within 4 years, they spent 17 billion over, 35,000 NGOs.
Yep.
Now, after the Pride, they wanted to spend 1 billion and they already had, I don't know how many NGOs ready. Then I'm wondering, where do all these NGOs magically come from? But the dangerous part of it is that it can be seen as a way, or it is used as a tool where it looks like there's consensus from the people, even though it's just another layer of uncontrolled power by our own government while we are paying for it. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to jump in and say, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's one of the things that's been revealed is that when the Trump administration they ended USAID, we learned that there was a huge amount of NGOs as well as journalism organizations, media organizations that were being funded by the US government and were basically doing government propaganda. They were running essentially information operations, very similar to what the intelligence community, the CIA, has done for decades. And we saw, groups like Internews and OCCRP. These are groups that were basically, cutouts or intermediary organizations for the CIA, for intelligence organizations. And when that money went away, those NGOs, basically lost, much of their staff. And so I think that's one of the big challenges, is to either demand some fairness in how that NGO money is spent or just cut it. Because what we thought was an organic left-wing movement really turned out to be something that was a state-funded operation to maintain power. I'll add one other part of it. The other thing that shocked us to learn is that the German government has spent hundreds of millions of dollars, I think it's billions of dollars, on a movement called Fight the Right. So the government is actually openly politicized and attacking one side of the political spectrum.
And in America, at least you have a system within the president can say, okay, we're going to ban the US aid, and then it's done. They're out of business. Unfortunately for us in the European Union, that's much more complicated because, well, to our disadvantage, the people that built that structure were smart enough to protect themselves. Well, how do you think we can cut not just the red tape, but also these NGOs? Because there's a lack of accountability. Here in Hungary, there was a very fair request. It's okay, if you're going to be foreign funded, we want to have transparency where that money is coming from, because we know that Soros is also having a lot of influence here, using NGOs, civil societies, European Commission, same playbook. We cannot just have the US aid cut off like you did in the States, but we need to have some sort of, that needs to be restructured. How can we do that?
I mean, I think obviously, the main event is still political regime change. So you need to have, more conservative parties coming to power who will then cut off that funding, or at least make the funding more balanced between left and right wing causes. I think until then, journalism plays an essential role. I've been exploring an effort to build a journalism organization in Europe. It's something I'm very interested in because I don't think that the mainstream news media is covering the situation fairly here. Americans are not very interested in Europe. We have most Americans, we tend to want to be focused on ourselves. I think most countries outside of Europe tend to be a little bit more provincial in that way. But I just see there's a huge story of what's happening in Europe right now. The mass migration, the fertility crisis, the free speech crisis. It's obviously a super dynamic place. And so we've been trying to bring together more journalists, supporting investigative journalism, exposing them. I mean, sunlight remains the best disinfectant. And so I think that these independent investigative journalism efforts are essential. And I would just advertise to you and your colleagues and anybody else, we're looking for good investigative reporters to engage in this work and expose the censorship industrial complex as well as the lawfare that's being done against conservatives.
Definitely, because that's how the globalists play it. They produce the information, with that they can control the narrative, and who controls the narrative controls reality,
Yes.
and in essence, people as well.
Yeah.
Then
it's everything. I would just add to that. I think it's everything. And what we know, we saw, so we've done a lot on exposing the censorship industrial complex. It kind of came out of our work with the Twitter files. We've then sought to understand how it was essentially a reaction to the rise of social media, where the regime essentially felt like it was losing control over the narrative. But one of the things that we've seen there too is that this shift within the intelligence community and the censorship industrial complex has been to narrative, has been to story. At the very end of the censorship industrial complex, at the peak of its power in the United States, their leaders were heavily focused on narrative, and they were trying to censor even accurate information in the idea that it was in service of the wrong narrative. So I absolutely agree with you. I think being in a situation to challenge the dominant narrative and argue for a different story is the main event in many ways.
Michael, sometimes I think to myself, it is so obvious to see what's happening in the world. The Digital Service Act is in essence a censorship law. Mm-hmm. And then still, the mainstream media, the narratives that they're pushing, they're so powerful because, in essence, there's still a majority out there that believes the narrative that is being opposed to them.
Well, and even more terrifying is there's a huge number of our fellow citizens that want the government to censor their political opponents. And one thing we have found that we have learned, and I did a set of interviews on the streets of Ireland, is that support for free speech is unfortunately not intuitive. When you look at little kids often playing together, you'll see them telling each other to shut up, shut up. You'll see that similar infantile reaction from politicians. The German politicians don't think that they should be criticized or insulted online. It's a very intuitive response to want to shut up people. It's a much more evolved and mature view that would allow free speech. And so one of the things you have to do is just create the conversation around censorship. I think that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, is making a huge mistake. I think he's making the same mistake that President Lula of Brazil made, same mistake that the European leaders are making in their censorship drive. They may make some progress in the short term, but I think long term, the side that is on the side of free speech is going to do much better than the side that's on the side of censorship. It helps just to call it what it is. We should call it a censorship act, as you were saying. It's not the Digital Services Act, it's the Digital Censorship Act. We should call it that, we should give it the name, and we should explain where it comes from, what the story of it is. And then I think we should point out that, look, it's pathological. I'm not going to name names, but many of the people that are pushing censorship, I just think there's something really wrong with them. They're very intolerant. These are often characteristics of narcissism. There's been studies of left-wing authoritarianism as a manifestation of narcissism. Narcissists, don't want to be criticized. They're very thin-skinned. They see the world in black and white. They imagine that the truth is something obvious when in fact we know that often you need to have debate and discussion in order to figure out what the truth is. So I think being able to slow the citizenry down and sort of point out, look, we know that truth is something that emerges in conversation. It's not something that comes from the government, certainly. I think when you slow people down and make them think more slowly about what the implications of it are, I think they will then come around to our side.
I think listening to guys is key, as you said, and language is so powerful with that. But then some people just don't want it, right? They want to live a good life, they want to have a simple life, but they are forming the silent majority that are allowing this to happen.
Yeah, look, I think that there's, probably about 30% of the public that is, quite totalitarian, quite censorial. We're not going to be able to move those folks. I think there's probably another 30% on the right that are, strong in support of free speech and democracy. I think the people in the middle are the ones that you have to win over. It has to be daily. I mean, this is why I was interested in doing a newspaper here, is that I think you have to really you have to report on these events and show how what the mainstream news media is showing is wrong. There's a big problem one of the big problems with censorship is the Streisand effect, named after Barbra Streisand, who tried to censor photographs of her home online. Only 2 people had looked at the photograph. Then she sued to take the photograph down, and there was millions of people that went to see it. So drawing attention to the things that are being censored is often a way to attract more attention for them. So you can turn censorship to your advantage. I think the other thing that's going for those of us that advocate for free speech is that when people see the mainstream news media not reporting the truth on certain issues, say, for example, higher rates of violent crime by immigrant populations, we have good statistics on that. We know that's the case. When the mainstream media is not reporting on that and people find it out through other sources, it reduces the credibility of the mainstream news media significantly. In the United States, it's a really remarkable moment because trust in the news media has reached an all-time low, 31%. The Democratic Party has also reached an all-time low. It's below 30%. So you see there is about 30% of the public that's still in favor of what I would consider hard left censorial policies. But that means the other 70% is up for grabs. And I would think that is a huge opportunity for enterprising journalists and politicians in Europe.
Yeah, I remember seeing Trump speak during the NATO summit, and he said it to CNN as well. When I started, your credibility rate was 80 and it plummeted to, I think, what is it, 14 or something percent right now?
Yes.
On a more serious note, we talked about a lot of issues that you addressed, fertility rate going down by natives of the European continent, of course, net zero policies. We have, what is it now, 1 in 3, 1 in 4 people living in energy poverty, the open border crisis, rising of AI. In your terms, what do you think is the biggest threat for our future?
I think the biggest threat is just, I think in terms of a story, it's really the suicidal, I would say, civilizational suicide in Europe. After World War II, there was an understandable desire for creating open societies and for a weakening of cultural traditions, weakening of nationalist traditions. There was a sense in which we needed to prevent another war, we needed to prevent racial and nationalist animosity. But it went to the point of such extremes that there created a homogenous culture, a desire to sort of, the idea that you can just bring in entirely different populations of people with different values, different ethics, and them instantly assimilating. Obviously, that hasn't happened. And so, you look at things like the move towards scarce, expensive energy. Energy is required for the whole economy, and so it's a form of civilizational suicide to continue to pursue that. Mass migration, replacing your population and not assimilating the newer groups of people, also a form of civilizational suicide. So, I think we have to just remind people of how special Europe is. There's never been a civilization like this before on Earth. Most of humankind has lived under authoritarian leaders without free speech. Western Europe gave birth to this just a few hundred years ago, and I think we have to fight to protect it.
Guys, can you wrap it up?
Okay, one more question then.
Sure.
You gave two more questions, I promise. I'll be short. So first and foremost, you gave a wonderful speech at ARC, and it was about how we don't need AI, we don't need more intelligence. We need to focus more about virtue and morality. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I should just say I'm very pro AI. I use AI every day. I think it's really useful for a lot of things, including grammatical checks and spelling checks on my articles. I don't think that any of our biggest problems are caused by a lack of AI, and I don't think AI can solve any of those biggest problems. So the ones we just talked about, of censorship, of mass migration, of the scarce and expensive energy, they're not caused by AI. AI is not going to solve them. We have to get back to these, cardinal virtues, justice, truth, courage, prudence, temperance. These are the values that gave rise to all of the freedoms that we enjoy and take for granted today. So I think that we just have our society is very left-brained in the sense that it's very focused on machines and logic and rationality. I think we need to reintroduce a more contextual, creative way of seeing the world, like the kind we saw during the Renaissance in Europe.
And then the last question, and I think maybe this is the most important one, because from October in Europe we'll have the CBDC, and that will be probably the last step towards totalitarianism, because if you don't have your financial freedom, you're doomed. You cannot flee, you cannot go left or right, because the state will control you if they can control you financially. Yet there's still a little time frame wherein national governments can push back. What can we do? Because I don't feel that people understand that urge.
No, we absolutely have to resist the digital ID with everything we can. It is absolutely, it's an immediate shift to a totalitarian society. What they want to do is link your social media to your bank account, to your vaccination record. It's an effort to control people. It's quite sinister. They're basically replicating what they do in China as a way of control. Must resist it at all costs, because I fear that once you have a digital ID system in place, then we will rapidly see all of our other rights taken away from us.
Well, Michael, I know our time's up, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Scarlett.
And we're looking forward to see your newspaper here in Europe.
Wonderful. I hope to get it off the ground. Thanks, Scarlett.
Thank you.